Hello again. Thank you for joining us for another devotional moment with the Our Father's House of Worship team. My name is Joe Lewis, and as you all know, we're studying the book of Genesis, and we're looking today at chapter 16. I must apologize once again. I was supposed to have this ready to go out, be uploaded and viewed on yesterday, the 17th. Got a little busy and a little behind, so do apologize for that. But in any regards, we're looking at chapter 16 of Genesis. Before we go any further, let's bow for a brief word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the Sabbath. Thank you for the lovely service we had today at church, for the sermon that was preached by Pastor Robbins, music, and it was good, wonderful worship service. And now, Lord, as we pause to look at this chapter 16 in your word, be with us, guide us in our study. In Jesus' name, amen. Genesis chapter 16. So now we are finding Abram and Sarai after God has revealed to Abram his covenant and made a covenant with Abram that we saw in chapter 15 that Pastor Robbins eloquently explained and went through on last Wednesday night during the Bible study. So here we find Abram and Sarai, and some time has passed when God made that covenant with Abram. And it starts off by saying, now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So if you recall in chapter 15, the covenant that God made with Abram, he says, that God told him, and behold, the word of the Lord came unto him, saying, this shall not be thine heir, speaking of Eleazar, but that the heir would come from Abram, right, out of his seed. And he brought him forth and said, look now toward heaven and tell the stars if thou be able to number them. And he said unto him, so shall thy seed be. So God is promising Abram here that he will have children and that his seed, his family, would be as countless as the stars and as the sand. And so, and it says here, and he believed in the Lord, and he, that is God, counted it to him, Abram, for righteousness. So Abram believed in what God had said and in the covenant that God made between him. However, we find now that some time has passed. Sarai is barren. She bare him no children. And so it says here that Sarai went to Abram and said, look, God has not... He's kept me back from having children. I pray thee, verse 2, go in unto my maid Hagar. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. So Abram believes he's going to have children, but after some time has passed, a number of years, obviously, Sarai is still barren. She has not had any children, and so she contrives an idea to have her husband Abram take her maid Hagar, marry her, make her his wife, and have children by her. And because she is Sarai's maid, they are legally, in that sense and in that culture, Sarai's children, and so that's how it was looked upon. And we find this, interestingly enough, like 2 generations later, the same thing happens in chapter 30 when we get to Jacob, when he marries Leah and Rachel. The same thing happens there. So we see this again happening amongst this family. So as it turns out, because there was an apparent delay in God's promise for Abram to have children, Sarai, his wife, says, look, take Hagar, my handmaid, and have children by her. It's interestingly enough, as we have read through Genesis, and we see on occasion where, Abram obviously has a connection, a relationship with God. But interestingly enough, we don't see here in this story, in this account in chapter 16, that Abram even consulted with God on this development. Sarai came with the idea, the suggestion, and there's no account here that Abram even went to God to talk to him about it or consult with God about it to see if this is what God would have him do. Now, also, when God made the covenant with Abram, he didn't mention anything about Sarai. It was just that Abram would have children, right? Now, it could be understood or implied that it will be with Sarai, but that was not really directly stated. You'll see in chapter 17 where God recounts this covenant with Abram, and this time, or in chapter 17, that next time he does that, he actually mentions, no, it's going to be with Sarah. You're going to have children with Sarah, and by then her name is Sarah. So I guess what I'm just trying to say here is some time passed. There was a period of waiting, and they got impatient. And unfortunately, even though the suggestion came up, Abram did not go back to God to say, Lord, is this what you would have me do? Would you have me marry Hagar and have children with Hagar? Or is the promise going to be fulfilled with my wife Sarai? So anyway, he goes on and he marries Hagar. And of course, as the story goes, Hagar conceives. And when Hagar, who was an Egyptian slave, let me pause. An Egyptian slave. Recall now in chapter 12 when Abram and his family were in Egypt, and the Pharaoh took Sarai to marry, and then found out, they were cursed, they were plagued, and then he found out that Sarah was actually Abram's wife and not his sister. They sent them away and blessed them with riches and whatnot, and also he gave them servants. You see here, verse 15 of chapter 12, it says, the princes also of Pharaoh saw her, speaking of Sarai, and commended her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And he, Pharaoh, entreated Abram well for her sake. And he had sheep, that means he gave him sheep. He gave him a dowry for Sarah or Sarai. Sheep, oxen, donkeys, and men servants, and maid servants. Okay, and camels. So this Egyptian servant or slave or maid, handmaid as she's referred to, from Egypt was from this transaction back in chapter 12 when Pharaoh took Sarai to hopefully have her become his wife, and he gave a dowry, and amongst the dowry were male servants and female servants, and Hagar was one of them. So that's where she came from. And so she conceives, and it says here in verse 4 of chapter 16 that when she conceived, when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. So now Hagar is with child, and because Sarai, who has been married now to Abram for many years, has not conceived and she's barren, and especially in those days, having children was a big deal. If you did not have children, it was, it wasn't a good thing. Anyway, she is now prideful. She's, arrogant, and now Sarai is despised in her eyes. And Sarai goes to Abram and says, behold, thy may, he says, my wrong be upon thee. It's interesting now that this was Sarah's idea. This was Sarah's idea, but because now things have gone sour, and Hagar is having attitude, if you want to call it that way, and being proud and arrogant and whatnot, and looking down on Sarai, Sarah blames Abram for doing this. And it was her suggestions, but she blames him. All right, not willing to take accountability for what she had done. So Abram says, look, in trying to keep the peace, he says, look, she's your handmaid. Do with her as you please. All right. And so Sarah, I guess Sarai, I keep saying Sarah, Sarai, her name's not Sarah yet. Sarai um, comes down on her, and probably, you can kind of understand why, right? But she comes down on her, treats her a little harshly or sternly, and Hagar doesn't like it, and she runs away. All right? She runs away. It says in verse 6, she fled from her face. This is where it gets interesting. Verse 7 of chapter 16. And the angel of the Lord found her, that is Hagar, by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way of Shur. Okay, and he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid. Interesting that he referred to Hagar, not just as Hagar, but Hagar, Sarai's maid. This angel, addresses her as Sarai's maid, basically saying to her, look, what are you doing? You're Sarai's maid. You're not, he's not elevating her pride. He's speaking to her and calls her as, in her position as Sarai's maid. Whence camest thou, and whither wilt thou go? All right? Where did you come from? Of course he knew. Where are you going? I'm sure she didn't even know. She was just running away from Sarai and the situation. And she says, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarai. Verse 8. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, return to your mistress, and not only return, but submit thyself under her hands. Okay? You are her maidservant. That is your position. He acknowledges her and addresses her in that position. And then he tells her to return and submit yourself to Hagar. Man, that, I'm sure she didn't like to hear that, but that's what he told her to do. And so it turns out that that's what she did. A lot of times, we have to understand that we need to keep our place. All right. We need to recognize oftentimes where God has placed us and stay in our lane, And so, he says to go back and submit yourself unto her, all right, as her maidservant, okay? That's what he tells her to do. And then he says, and the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. So he promises her, okay, that her child, or that her seed, the offspring that comes from her and from this child, will be multiplied greatly. Okay, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that he's Abram's child. Okay, the covenant that was mentioned in chapter 15 to Abram applies to this child, and so because of that, he's going to multiply her seed coming from this child. Okay, and verse 11. And I love verse 11, and I'll tell you why in a moment. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child. Okay? So, in her eyes, he's only seeing her for the first time, but this is an angel of the Lord. And we could even say this is Jesus Christ himself in his pre-human form, in his divine form. All right? Speaking to her and saying, thou art with child, and shall bear a son. Tells her what sex of the child she will have, all right? You're a child, and you're going to have a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Ishmael. Now, this is, and you can check me, this is perhaps, I believe this is the first time and one of few times where God actually names the child that's going to be born. He gives the name. He tells the parent or parents what to name the child when they're born or before they're even born. This is one of the few times it's done in the Bible, and I believe that this is the first time that it's actually recorded. And he says, thou shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. Now, I like this verse because two family members of mine had this name Ishmael. My uncle, my father, on my dad's side, his baby brother was named Ishmael. I'm trying to pull up my computer here. His baby brother was named Ishmael. And one of my younger brothers, not the youngest, but the next to youngest, his name was Ishmael as well. He was named after that uncle. And I always liked the name, but I really didn't pay attention to it until after I had to perform the eulogy at my brother's memorial last summer. He passed away last summer due to complications from type 1 diabetes. He was type 1 diabetic since the age of 9. He passed away at the age of 46. Anyway, his name was Ishmael, and at the memorial, I actually went back and looked at his name, and the name Ishmael is very powerful. And it literally means in the Hebrew that he, the mighty one, listens and responds, or that he, the mighty one, obviously referring to God, has listened and responded. The name Ishmael implies that God hears us when we call out to him in our affliction, and that he also responds to our call or to our cry, to our pleas, and to our prayers. And then when you have that understanding, okay, and you combine that with Isaiah 64:24 and even Romans 8:28, you put those together, you come away understanding that God hears us even before we call. Before we need him, he is already on the way, and he has already seen, he already knows, and he has already anticipated our need and has already begun or even has been working the situation out for our good. All right? And so the name Ishmael means, for the Lord hath heard, what is it here? I'm sorry. Hath heard thy affliction. God heard her, and he answered. He met her at this well, or this spring of water, made her this promise after telling her to go back home, submit herself to Sarai, and she would have a son. He would be, and her children would be numerous, be a great multitude, become a great nation. And his name would be Ishmael, because God has heard her affliction. And he goes on to describe her son, how he would be, how he'd be a wild man, it says. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. He would be a warring, there would be a warring people, if you want to put it that way. And it is understood that from Ishmael has descended the Arab nation. And we know the warring factions, the historical animosities and differences that both of those groups of people have had. And they're actually cousins, or not even cousins, they're siblings. And so it's unfortunate that has happened. Had Abram consulted with God before he made this decision to go along with Sarai and marry Hagar and have a son by her, that whole situation that we see now in the world could have potentially been avoided. But nonetheless, this is what we see, this is what we have. And so it says here in verse 13 that Hagar called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, I have also here looked after him that seeth me. So she's saying at this spot, not only did God see me, but I saw God. And so she calls the place Beer Lahai. Beer Lahai is the name of that place. And it was some place by Shur at this spring of water. And we'll find this name coming up again and again, repeatedly as we go through Genesis with Isaac and Jacob, because they lived or ventured near this place. So I had a little thing here on that name itself here. Let me see what it says. It says here that name that Hagar called Beer Lahai, okay, it says here that the name means the well of him that lives and sees me, or the well of the vision of life. I thought it was interesting that that was the interpretation. The gospel is a well of life, living water springing up out of us, as Jesus has said. And I find it interesting that God met her at this well, at this spring of water, and gave her this promise of life, not only for herself, but also for her offspring. And she says that I saw God and he saw me. And oftentimes we may not see God, but he definitely sees us, and he meets us in our place of affliction, place of need, and to bring us through, to bring us great promises even, if we would be humble and submit to him. But this is what we find in chapter 16. Chapter 16, we see now the introduction of Hagar and Ishmael, and then we will read later on how this dynamic continues to play out in the life of Abram and Sarai and others coming later on in this book. Anyway, that's all I have for today. I hope that you were able to gather something as we studied, as we continue to go through Genesis and continue to look at the life of Abram and his family. I think the big takeaway here in this particular chapter was whatever decision we make, we need first to consult with God. That's the first thing. That's one of the first points that we find from what we see and glean from chapter 16, right? Is before we make any decision, great or small, go to God with it and get his direction, get his counsel, either from his word or in just directly praying and communing with God, perhaps even fasting, to get clarity, to get understanding as to what you should do. That's the first point. The second point is stay in your lane. Where God has placed you, where God has allowed you to be content in that position, regardless of how tough certain things may go, all right? And of course, if that's where God would have you remain, that's the other thing. Certain situations you may not, I don't want to say you should stay in every situation, especially if it's really bad, harmful, morally wrong, dangerous, those types of things. But if for some reason God has placed you there, and you know that God has placed you there, then definitely stay there, or at least counsel with him before you make any other changes. That's the other thing we bring out. But then also know that God is a God that not only hears us in our time of affliction, but he responds to our prayers, especially in time of affliction. All right? Anyway, that's it. Don't want to keep you any longer. I wish you a good day. And we look forward to lesson chapter 17 on Monday.